Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time to the distant sands of ancient Egypt. As you settle in for a restorative sleep or a moment of calm, I invite your mind to drift through the silence of the desert where time stretches like the horizon and the breath of the past lingers in the air. Let your thoughts meander through the whispering reeds along the Nile, beneath the scorching skies, among the shadows of colossal stones, and into the hearts of those who lived, labored, and were forgotten. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle historical journeys. And if you resonate with this soft and immersive style of storytelling, a quiet click on the subscribe button would be much appreciated. It's thoughtful listeners like you who keep this series of historical tales flowing smoothly. Perhaps you're listening to this in the quiet hours of the night, your room dimly lit or cloaked in shadow, your breath slow, your body heavy with the weariness of the day. Maybe your thoughts refuse to settle, circling like the winds that once swept through ancient courtyards and open fields. That's okay. This story is for you, for those lying awake, for those who feel the weight of the day lingering in their bones, for those seeking a gentle companion through the long hours of the night. Tonight, let us walk together through a history that breathes with both splendor and sorrow. Close your eyes if you'd like. Imagine the warm, grainy touch of sandstone beneath your hands, the scent of dust and sweat in the air, the faint tremor of drums echoing from a distant temple. Hear the call of a water carrier winding through a sleeping village. Feel the oppressive heat of a sun that never relents. We are not entering the Egypt of textbook diagrams or museum placards. We are stepping into the lived Egypt, the aching Egypt, the Egypt where the divine light of the gods shone not only on temples and kings, but burned mercilessly upon the backs of those who served in silence. We begin in a place most stories leave untouched, beneath the pyramid, not atop it, within the mud brick home of a laborer, not the palace of a pharaoh, in the dry and cracked fields that awaited the Nile's blessing each year. We begin with the unnamed, the unseen, and the uncelebrated. Ancient Egypt, as the world remembers it, is a symbol of glory, elegance, and the eternal. The towering pyramids, the hieroglyphs carved deep into stone, the gold of funerary masks, and the shimmering silence of tombs untouched for millennia. But this is the Egypt of the immortal few, a fraction of lives gilded in narrative and preserved in history's amber. Beyond that, another Egypt unfolded every day. A harsher, humbler world built on calluses and cracked skin, on backs bent too early, on mouths fed too little. It was a world where life pulsed under a relentless sun, where every breath was a negotiation with dust, where labor was not a choice, but a fate. There were no scrolls written to remember these lives, no statues raised, no temples echoing their names. But they lived, they suffered. They bore witness to the glory of kings, even as they paid the price for it with their blood, their hunger, their silence. In this long, quiet narrative, we will walk slowly alongside them. We will feel the dry soil between our fingers as we kneel to plant the season's seeds. We will wake before the dawn with aching limbs, summoned by voices that never asked our name. We will carry stones for walls we will never touch again. We will offer prayers to gods we were told demanded our suffering. And we will lie down at night in homes too small, too hot, too crowded to dream of anything but relief. Perhaps you, too, know what it is to carry burdens without recognition, to give and remain invisible, to feel tired not just in body but in spirit. The ancient world, in all its majesty, was not immune to these truths. and in knowing their pain we may better understand our own. Let this be a space not just for sleep, but for remembrance. Not only of dates and dynasties, but of people whose lives are echoes, faint but persistent, buried beneath centuries of silence. Let us listen. Tonight's story is not about the throne. It is about the dust. It is about the space between greatness and the grave, the long, sun-scorched road walked by millions whose names are now lost to time. The Egypt of extremes, of hunger and heat, of devotion and despair. Of greatness built not only by divine decree, but by the quiet endurance of the human body and the trembling resilience of the soul. And so, we begin. With breath, with quiet. With the first step into the forgotten world that lies just behind the image of eternity. Let the rhythm of history lull you into a deeper stillness. The wind is rising, and the past is calling gently from beneath the sand. The image of ancient Egypt that often inhabits our imagination is one of splendor, an eternal land of gold and ceremony, of god-kings and monumental architecture rising against a horizon scorched by sun and time. It is a place where immortality seemed carved into every stone, where the divine walked among mortals, and where the afterlife was a promise draped in linen and lotus. But beyond the gleam of pharaohs' masks and the solemn stillness of preserved tombs, there is another Egypt. One harder to see, one rarely told. This is the Egypt not of eternity but of exhaustion, not of marble floors but of dirt beneath fingernails. A civilization that has endured in our collective memory for thousands of years, yet one whose daily life, for the majority, was lived in silence and pain. Here, beneath the surface of grandeur, the price of existing under the gaze of divine rulers was staggering. The common Egyptian, whether farmer, laborer, servant, or conscripted youth, lived not in the golden light of eternity, but in the oppressive blaze of a sun that never forgave. The sun that illuminated the palaces and temples of gods was the same that seared the skin of the working poor, day after day, season after unchanging season. For those not born into royalty, Egypt was a place of unending repetition. The plow and the pickaxe, the mortar and the mat, these were the tools of life. Each morning brought with it the same rituals of survival. A handful of dates or barley, a jar of water, not always clean, the brief rustle of birds in the early light, then labor. Always labor. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Imagine a man with shoulders already sagging, long before middle age, rising before the sun has touched the rooftops, his wife grinding grain in the half-light, her hands raw from the effort. Their children, thin and silent, already preparing to carry jugs of water or gather dung for fuel. There is no music here, no feasts, just the rustling of linen garments, the low murmurs of waking households, and the ever-present whisper of dust being stirred beneath tired feet. For many, there was no ownership of land. What they cultivated belonged to the temple or the palace. Their harvests were measured, taxed, collected. Even when the Nile was generous, the reward might not reach their mouths. The grain they reaped might be carted away to state granaries, kept under lock and symbol for use in festivals, tributes, and ceremonies, to which they were never invited. The pharaoh was divine, his needs sacred, his comfort a reflection of cosmic order. The people's suffering, by contrast, was often framed as necessary, even holy. To serve was not only civic duty, but a spiritual one. Obedience was moral. To question, to falter, to rest, these were not merely physical failures, but transgressions of cosmic law. And so they carried stones. They dug canals. They hauled blocks for temples whose gods would never hear their names. Their sweat was part of the mortar. their size buried beneath painted murals. While scribes recorded the words of kings and high priests, no one recorded the aches in their joints, the hunger that knotted their bellies, the fear that lingered after punishment. There is a painting in a noble's tomb that shows rows of workers building a structure. They are hunched, skeletal, faceless. Behind them stands a man holding a stick. This was not an unusual scene. It was life. To understand ancient Egypt fully is to acknowledge this brutal duality, the eternal and the ephemeral, the preserved and the perished, the throne and the threshold of survival. For every monument that stands, there were countless bodies that fell. For every tomb that gleams, there are thousands of graves unmarked, bodies swallowed by desert and time. And yet within this suffering, there was also a quiet endurance, the capacity to persist, to rise again tomorrow, to hold a child against a sunlit wall and whisper a lullaby beneath the roar of heat. There was resistance, not through rebellion, but through survival, through continuing to exist, day after unrelenting day. The Egypt we explore tonight is not one of gods and kings. It is the Egypt of the poor, the hungry, the sunburnt, the ones who lived in the cracks of empire, the ones whose shadows passed over stones we now marvel at, without knowing their names. This was their Egypt, harsh, beautiful, unforgiving, and real. We will walk further into their world, into hunger, into heat, into the quiet despair and dignity of those whose stories have waited far too long to be told. Let the silence stretch, and in that silence, let us listen. In the vast, unyielding silence of the Egyptian desert, there was one force that made life possible. It was not the pharaoh, nor the gods, nor even the sun that bathed the land in golden severity. It was the Nile, that long, coiling ribbon of water flowing northward through sand and stone was more than a river. It was a breath held and released with the rhythm of the seasons. It was time, it was promise, it was sustenance. And when it failed, when its waters did not rise as they should have, the world unraveled quietly and the people turned to dust. Each year the Nile was expected to flood. This annual inundation, known as the Akhet, was the foundation upon which the entire economy and spiritual structure of Egypt was built. As the river swelled with waters from distant rains far to the south, it would spill over its banks and soak the surrounding land, depositing a rich, dark silt that made farming possible in an otherwise inhospitable world of rock and dryness. The floodwaters were awaited with anticipation, with offerings and prayers, and with a kind of sacred anxiety, because if they failed to arrive, the consequences were catastrophic. The failure of the Nile's flood was not a singular event, but a prolonged, creeping disaster. One missed inundation could be endured. Two in succession spelled famine. The soil remained dry, cracked, and useless. Seeds planted with hope died beneath the surface. Entire villages began to watch the sky with a kind of helpless intensity, hoping for signs that would not come. The state, with its administrative machinery, kept careful records, height markers along the river, data scribes noting fluctuations. But knowledge was not power for the poor. It was merely a distant awareness that others had the means to understand what they could not control. For the common farmer, the signs of a failed flood were far more visceral. Fields remained dusty. Irrigation ditches ran empty. The color green became a memory. The wind, once carrying the scent of damp earth, returned dry and sharp, carrying with it nothing but dust and foreboding. Then came the slow depletion. Families turned to their storage jars and pulled out what was left. Grains from the previous year, stored with care, were rationed sparingly. Mothers ground the last of the barley with trembling fingers. Fathers measured handfuls with the gravity of priests administering sacraments. Every seed eaten was a seed not planted. Every meal was a gamble against tomorrow. At first, people sold possessions, tools, furniture, jewelry passed down from ancestors. Then came the livestock, goats, chickens, the rare cow. Then eventually came the body, labor. Children promised to temples, daughters given in marriage to older men in exchange for bread. A slow, aching descent into desperation, marked not by screams or revolt, but by the quiet diminishment of choice. The granaries of the state still held reserves. The tall, stone-lined silos attached to temple complexes and palace grounds remained full, their contents guarded by scribes and overseers. But these stores were not freely distributed. The state considered grain a political instrument. Food could secure loyalty, suppress dissent, and reinforce hierarchy. When the poor came begging, they were often turned away. Unless they could offer labor or service or obedience, they were left to starve in the shadows of the wealth that surrounded them. It is a painful image, a starving child leaning against a mud brick wall, just a few hundred yards from a temple where wheat is being baked into offerings for the gods. Bread burned ritually while bellies burned from emptiness. Some turned to the wild, roots, reeds, insects. Some boiled leather, scraped moss from stones, gathered bitter leaves. Anything that could fill the stomach, however briefly, became sustenance. Others chewed on dirt, clay, or crushed limestone mixed with traces of flour. The body, confused and betrayed, responded with illness, swelling limbs, failing kidneys, blindness, collapse, and death. There are hints of these stories in archaeological remains, skeletons with signs of prolonged starvation, teeth worn down by sand and grit, bones deformed by malnutrition. The annals of kings rarely mention the famines, but the land remembers. The people who lived through them passed down the knowledge in whispers, in lullabies that warned children to be quiet when hungry. In myths that made the Nile a moody god, easily angered, and always behind the hunger, there was the fear. Fear that the river might never return, that the gods had turned away, that life, so fragile and cyclical, had broken. But the people endured, not because they were rewarded, but because they had no other choice. Endurance became a form of resistance. To live another day was to defy the silence of the state, the indifference of the elite, the unpredictability of the elements. When the Nile failed, Egypt did not fall, but it trembled, and in that trembling, millions bore the weight of a civilization's fragility, not in stone, but in the hollow of their bellies, not in language, but in longing. So remember this as we continue. Egypt's glory, its monuments, its memory, was often preserved at the cost of empty stomachs. The hunger of the many sustained the splendor of the few, and the river, sacred and merciless, continued to flow. There are moments in history when hunger exceeds the bounds of metaphor. It becomes not merely a feeling or a sensation, but a physical reality that reshapes the limits of what the human body will tolerate and what the human soul will accept in order to survive. In ancient Egypt, when the Nile failed and the granaries closed their doors, hunger stopped being a quiet companion and became an unrelenting tyrant. During these long, dry seasons, survival drove people to the margins of what could even be considered food. The images painted in tombs and etched into temple walls depict abundance: baskets of bread, jugs of beer, figs piled high, tables laden with meats. But these images were aspirations, not mirrors of daily life. They belonged to the dreams of the wealthy, the funerary wishes of those who could pay to be remembered. Outside these painted walls, in villages reduced to ash and thirst, another diet took hold, one not of desire, but of desperation. Clay, barrow, earth. These were not symbolic elements. they became ingredients. When the body had been emptied of its reserves, when the last grain had been shared, and the final goat boiled into broth, people turned to the ground itself. The earth they had once tilled for sustenance was now consumed directly, not as metaphor, but as meal. Archaeological records, studies of human remains, traces found in the digestive residue of long-dead intestines reveal the shocking truths of these times. People mixed finely crushed clay with remnants of flour, creating a pale, gritty paste that could be shaped into discs and heated. The result resembled bread in form, but not in nourishment. It filled the stomach, yes, but it also poisoned. The clay damaged the kidneys, caused swelling of the abdomen, severe cramps, and intestinal bleeding. Yet it was better than nothing, or so many believed. In some regions, people harvested the leaves of trees not meant for food. Acacia, tamarisk, even papyrus. Dried, ground, and boiled, the resulting stew was bitter and barely digestible. But bitterness became a language of survival. So too did bark, boiled down for hours, or even the crushed remnants of straw once used as livestock bedding. These were consumed not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. The human instinct to live is stubborn, and when all else is stripped away, that instinct can turn even the most improbable matter into sustenance. Accounts that survived from scribes, rare and filtered through the lens of the literate elite, describe these times with a kind of distant horror. They speak of the people eating things that do not belong in the mouth. They mention grass chewed from the roadside and the smell of rot from the mouths of the desperate. These were not exaggerations. They were the quiet acknowledgments of what starvation could drive a person to endure. In some cases, people consumed animal dung, not as a source of food in itself, but to find within it remnants of undigested grain. Insects were gathered and mashed into paste. Even mud from stagnant riverbanks was filtered, dried, and chewed slowly. Not for taste, not even for nutrition, simply for the illusion of eating. The psychological toll of this descent was enormous. Parents wept while feeding their children mixtures of dirt and dried leaves. Shame settled over entire households. The simple act of chewing became a reminder of loss. And yet it was done, day after day, because hope, fragile and flickering, had not been extinguished. Somewhere in the mind of every starving laborer, there remained the belief that the Nile might rise again, that the rains would come, that food, real food, might return. There are even whispers preserved in forbidden texts and unofficial tales of cannibalism, of the dead not being buried but consumed, of children disappearing. These accounts are rare, hushed, and often dismissed as exaggerations, but their presence, even as rumor, speaks to the depths of suffering endured. We often think of starvation as a period of waiting, but in ancient Egypt it was a time of improvisation, of quiet horror, of transformation. The body was forced to consume not only the world around it, but eventually itself, muscle, fat, even bone. The eyes sank, the skin cracked, and still the people rose each day to search for something, anything, that might allow them to see another dawn. But what does it mean to chew on what the earth itself has rejected? What does it mean to fill your mouth with things meant only to be walked upon? These are not abstract questions. They were answered silently every day, in every village that waited for the river's return. The pyramids still stood, the temples still sang. But in the homes without food, the sound was not of prayer. It was the sound of grinding stone, the rustle of dried leaves, the soft crunch of clay between teeth. This was another face of Egyptian civilization. One rarely carved in stone, but embedded deeply in the soil. The same soil that once ingested often became the last thing a person would ever consume. There are landscapes where the sun is a gift, gentle, golden, a symbol of warmth and life. And then there are lands where the sun rules like a tyrant. In ancient Egypt, that unrelenting orb in the sky was both venerated and feared. It governed not just time, but effort. It set the tempo for existence, and for millions of workers, it was less a celestial body than a whip in the sky. Their days began before the first hint of light, and the moment the sun rose, it demanded everything. The rural worker, the laborer, the quarryman, the field hand, none of them woke with the sun. They were already working when it crept above the horizon. Their bodies stirred in darkness to the sound of feet on compact earth, to murmured commands, to the shuffling of sandals on dust. There was no time to stretch, no time to savor morning. Work began in the half-light before the sky had even considered blue. By the time the first gold streaks painted the tops of palm trees, men were already knee-deep in mud, cutting irrigation channels with wooden tools worn smooth by years of handling. Others were hauling baskets of stone, clay, or sand, their backs bowed not from reverence, but from exhaustion. Women, too, were in motion, grinding grain, fetching water, kneading dough in ovens still dark from the night before. Children, small and silent, carried jars or led donkeys loaded with firewood. The sun had not yet warmed the air, and already the day pressed hard on every muscle. As the light intensified, so did the labor. The sun did not allow for idleness. There were quotas to meet, tasks to complete, overseers to obey. Supervisors, often with whips or staffs, moved among the workers with a sharp eye for hesitation. Silence was expected. Voices raised in complaint or even conversation were often silenced in more permanent ways. Rest was not part of the routine. Shade was scarce and often not permitted. Breaks were determined by the needs of the task, not the needs of the body. Water was distributed in small, regulated amounts, often warm from hours exposed to the sun. Those who collapsed were not consoled. They were dragged aside. Some recovered. Others did not. The sun burned not just the skin, but the mind. Prolonged exposure caused disorientation, slowed movement, and eventually hallucinations. The term sun madness was whispered in corners, though it had no official recognition. A man who began the day with clarity might end it lost in confusion, his thoughts scattered like dry husks on the wind. And yet, the work continued. In the great building sites of temples and tombs, laborers climbed scaffolding with blocks of stone balanced on their shoulders. In quarries, the air shimmered with heat that radiated off rock surfaces. In fields, the soil dried to a crust by midday, becoming harder to plow, less yielding with each hour. The sun punished equally but unequally. Those of status found refuge, cool chambers, shaded courtyards, cold drinks, but the common worker had no such refuge. For them, the sun was an authority greater even than the pharaoh. It judged their speed, measured their endurance, and marked the passage of time in pain and sweat. By late afternoon, shadows stretched long across the land. But relief was not immediate. Work continued until the sun nearly touched the horizon. Only then, when the sky turned from fire to ash, were the tools set down. Muscles trembled, feet bled, eyes squinted against the residual glare. Home was not far, but the journey felt endless. At night, the sun departed, but it left its echo in every body it had touched. Backs ached, skin burned. Sleep was shallow and restless, and always there was the knowledge that in a few hours it would begin again. That cruel, golden drumbeat of labor and heat. In Egyptian religion, the sun was the god Ra, a creator, a source of order and rebirth. But for those who lived beneath it, every day was a kind of crucible. It tested not faith, but flesh. It demanded devotion not through prayer, but through suffering. This is not the Egypt of shaded palaces or leisurely banquets. This is the Egypt of sweat-darkened linen, of swollen hands and cracked heels, an Egypt where time was measured in blisters and where the horizon, glowing with fire each morning, signaled not beauty, but burden. In the grand fresco of Egyptian civilization, where gods moved among men and kings claimed descent from the heavens, there existed another force, silent, powerful, and purposefully obscured. It was not recorded in sacred hymns or carved in monumental reliefs. It moved beneath the surface, beneath the wealth, beneath the sacred order of Maat. It was the labor of the enslaved. Egypt did not invent slavery, nor was it the only ancient culture to build its glory upon forced labor. But within its shimmering legacy of temples and tombs, statues and cities, the role of slavery was not merely present, it was essential. Without it, the machinery of state, the machinery of memory itself, could not have functioned. Slavery in ancient Egypt wore many forms. There were prisoners of war, men, women, and children captured during the long campaign south into Nubia or east into the Levant. These were not merely enemies defeated. They were lives converted into state property. Some were marched across deserts, chained together, their identities already dissolving into utility. Others never made the journey. They died on the way, their names already forgotten. There were slaves by debt. A man who could not repay what he owed might surrender his own freedom or that of his children. A crop lost to drought, a sick cow, an unfair tax. These were enough to begin a descent into bondage. The debtor became a servant not just to his creditor, but to a system that recognized him now only as labor, not as citizen. And then there were those born into it. Children who opened their eyes for the first time beneath a thatched roof, already considered the property of someone else. They were raised not with lullabies, but with commands. Their games, if they had them, mimicked the chores they would soon perform. For them, there was no memory of freedom to mourn. Only the slow dawning of a life shaped entirely by others. The work they performed was vast and varied. In the quarries of Aswan and the mines of Sinai, enslaved men struck stone from the cliffs with copper tools that shattered like their fingers. In temple workshops, they ground pigments and kneaded clay. In noble estates, enslaved women carried water from distant wells, tended fires, nursed infants that were not their own. Some served in royal households, made invisible by their proximity to power. Others were sold repeatedly, passed from hand to hand like cattle, and still, the records remain sparse. Egyptian scribes were diligent, but they wrote at the pleasure of those in power. The names of the enslaved were often omitted or replaced with simple markers: the foreigner, the laborer, the owned. In this way, erasure was institutionalized. Slavery became not just a condition, but a silence. Yet the evidence remains in the bones of those buried without ceremony, often far from the tombs of the elite. Bodies show signs of repetitive stress injuries, fused joints, broken teeth, and crushed vertebrae. Some were buried with iron collars still encircling their necks. Others show marks on their bones consistent with restraints or whippings. Even in death, the violence was present. Slavery was not always marked by visible chains. Control came also through language, through ritual, through belief. The idea that some were born to serve and others to rule was reinforced not just in law, but in theology. Pharaohs were seen as gods. To serve them was framed as sacred. Even suffering could be interpreted as divine purification. In such a world, resistance was not just dangerous, it was heretical, and yet resistance did exist. Some escaped, though most were hunted and punished. Some broke tools, slowed their pace, feigned illness, small acts, quiet acts. Others endured without illusion, holding tightly to their memories, their songs, their names, even if no one else did. It is important to understand that the monuments we admire today, the colossal temples at Karnak, the precision of the pyramids, the sheer scale of Abu Simbel, were not merely architectural feats. They were instruments of control built on suffering. Every block of stone bore the weight of bodies that would never be remembered. Every inscription of triumph stood atop a foundation of servitude. The grandeur of ancient Egypt, so often framed as eternal, was maintained by those whose lives were ephemeral, disposable. They were the unseen hands in a society obsessed with visibility. And yet, even in silence, they left traces. Their labor endures, even if their names do not. To study them, to remember them, is not only to uncover a deeper truth about the past, it is to listen to those whose voices were never meant to be heard, to recognize that beneath every empire there is a shadow, and within that shadow, humanity still breathes. In the hushed rooms of modern museums and the sterile silence of archaeological labs, there lie fragments of the past that speak without words. Bones, cleaned, cataloged, placed under glass, or studied beneath artificial light. To the untrained eye, they are anonymous, but to those who look closely, they tell stories of lives not just lived, but endured. In ancient Egypt, the human body, especially the body of the laborer, was not merely a vessel of life. It was a tool. And like all tools, it wore down, broke, and bore the marks of its use long after breath had left it. When we imagine skeletons from antiquity, we often imagine royalty, perfect teeth, tall stature. Preserved remains wrapped in linen, accompanied by gold and ceremony. But these are exceptions. The ordinary Egyptian body, especially that of the working class, was carved by a life of repetition and burden. And it tells us more than any scroll or inscription what daily existence truly cost. Examinations of non-elite remains, those buried in communal cemeteries without goods, often without markers, reveal a physical language of labor. The vertebrae compressed. Discs worn to the point of collapse, spinal arthritis in teenagers, knees ground down from constant bending, lifting, squatting, shoulders torn by years of hauling stones or swinging tools, hands locked into permanent curvature, fingers twisted from gripping plows, baskets, ropes. The bones speak, and what they say is pain. In female skeletons, the pelvis often shows signs of multiple traumatic births, without intervention, without sanitation, without pause. Hip joints reveal the strain of carrying heavy loads while already carrying children. Arm bones thicken where repetitive grinding of grain forced muscles to adapt, and stress to settle deep into the marrow. Skulls show signs of nutritional deficiencies, thin cranial walls, porous bone, evidence of anemia from poor diets, especially during childhood. Children, too, bear the weight of this bodily history. Remains of those as young as 5 display early degeneration. Their bones, barely formed, already bent under labor. Growth was often stunted. Limb bones show irregular patterns, a sign of interrupted development due to malnutrition or overwork. Even their teeth, decayed, cracked, misaligned, tell of lives lived too fast, too hard, with too little rest or nourishment. The tools of Egyptian society were not only stone and copper, they were human. And these human tools were not preserved, honored, or named. They were used, worn out, and replaced. There are skeletons with healed fractures, arms that were broken and reset badly, ribs fused at odd angles, collarbones crushed. These injuries were not necessarily caused by accident, but often by force. The whip, the fall from scaffolding, the strain of carrying what no body should carry. There was no medical care beyond the prayers of family or the herbs of local women. Pain was private. and healing, if it came, was rarely complete. In some tombs near the work sites of temples or pyramids, collective burials have been found, mass graves of men who likely worked side by side and died close in time. Their remains, layered and tangled, show consistent patterns: ruptured vertebrae, crushed toes, spinal curvature, a common fate repeated endlessly. What makes these findings so haunting is not only the injuries themselves, but their uniformity. They tell of systemic conditions generations trained from childhood to endure, to adapt, to break slowly over time. It was not individual tragedy. It was policy, culture, economy, a way of life that saw the body not as sacred but as expendable. And yet, even in these damaged skeletons, there is resilience. Bones that tried to heal, joints that bore far more than they were meant to, spines that held up monuments. These were not weak people. They were strong beyond measure. But strength in their world was a sentence, not a virtue. They lived with pain as others live with weather, constant, inescapable, mundane. Their silence was not consent. It was the absence of anyone to listen. Now, centuries later, we listen, not through words, but through the quiet eloquence of bone, through the way a femur flares under weight, through the curvature of a spine that once lifted stones, through a tooth cracked by grit in bread ground between stones by exhausted hands. This too is memory. This too is history. A history written in bodies that never stopped working, even as they broke. A civilization not only built in stone, but carved into the flesh and marrow of those who had no choice but to endure. In ancient Egypt, pain was not always seen as a sign of injury, failure, or injustice. It was, at times, understood as a necessary act of purification, a sacred tax paid by the flesh for the promise of harmony. The gods, majestic and often merciless, were woven into every thread of life, every beat of labor, every ritual sacrifice. For the people who toiled beneath their gaze, suffering was not merely endured. It was explained. It was absorbed into a worldview where pain had meaning, and in some terrible way, purpose. Egyptian religion did not separate the sacred from the mundane. The divine was everywhere, in the Nile's flooding, in the rising of the sun, in the grain that sprouted, and the infant that cried. But this omnipresent sacredness came with weight. Order, what the Egyptians called ma'at, was the highest ideal, a divine balance that had to be maintained at all costs. Disorder, or isfet, was not only chaos but sin, threat, undoing, and one of the ways this order was preserved was through human suffering. Laborers, slaves, and peasants were not only serving the state, they were, by extension, serving the gods. The temples that loomed above the cities were not just architectural achievements. They were engines of cosmic stability, every block of stone carved, every wall painted, every grain offered in tribute. These were seen as gestures toward divine order. The pain required to produce them was part of the offering. The suffering itself became sacred. The theology of the time taught that the gods, especially those of justice, creation, and rebirth, required constant work from humanity. Ra, the sun god, traveled the sky each day in his boat, battling darkness each night. He was assisted by other deities, but also by the righteous efforts of mortals. Just as he struggled to maintain light, humans were expected to struggle to maintain the balance of the world. Their sweat mirrored the cosmic war. Their endurance, a quiet echo of divine perseverance. It was not uncommon for hymns to extol workers who gave their strength for the gods. In some texts, the laborer is praised not for building a temple, but for suffering during its construction. The act of pain itself, unspoken, unquestioned, was valorized. The whip was not always seen as punishment. It could be a tool of alignment, a way to ensure the soul and body moved in harmony with sacred duty. For those crushed under these expectations, resistance was not just socially dangerous, it was spiritually fraught. To disobey an overseer was to disrupt ma'at. To cry out or rest unbidden was to invite the creeping shadow of Isfet. Even silence, if not accompanied by labor, could be interpreted as a threat to divine order. And so obedience became not only a survival mechanism, but a spiritual posture. Rituals of purification often involved pain. Pilgrims walked for days barefoot across stone. Priests fasted until their bodies thinned. Women in mourning tore their clothes and hair, wailing until their voices broke. In sacred dramas, actors reenacted the death of gods through symbolic beating and binding. These were not anomalies, they were doctrines. Pain was part of the path to clarity, purity, transcendence. This understanding filtered into every crevice of daily life. A mother giving birth saw her agony not only as biological, but as sacred, a mirror of Isis laboring to protect her divine child. A farmer whose back cracked under a yoke might believe that his suffering appeased a god he could not name. A slave who was whipped for hesitating at a quarry could be told that his pain ensured the temple's success, and thus the country's survival. And perhaps the cruelest part of this religious scaffolding was its effectiveness. It was not enforced solely through fear or force. It was internalized. People believed it. They taught it to their children. They prayed with cracked lips and torn hands, not because they were ignorant, but because they had been told and had come to feel that the gods were watching, weighing, and requiring this of them. And so, the religion that filled Egypt with art, music, philosophy, and awe also justified an architecture of pain. It took human suffering and placed it in the ledger of cosmic necessity. It did not erase agony, but it gave it a frame, a shape, a divine excuse. Yet behind every offering placed at a god's feet was a tired body. Behind every temple door stood someone who would never enter it. Behind every hymn of praise, a voice hoarse from crying in the sun. Religion, for the elite, was a path to immortality. For the poor, it was often the explanation for their chains. And in that paradox, beauty built on burden, we find the hidden cost of divine order, not written in gold, but in scars, not whispered in prayers, but in moans muffled by dust. In the fragile order of ancient Egyptian society, silence was not peace, it was control. Labor was not a right, it was a demand, and obedience was not earned, it was enforced. Those who failed to meet expectations, who faltered under the weight of the sun or the burden of their tasks, were not met with understanding. They were met with punishment, and often these punishments left no mark on the scrolls of scribes, no mention in the decorated tombs, but they carved themselves deeply into flesh, into memory, into the very rhythm of survival. The Egyptian state, complex and ritualistic, rested on a foundation of invisible compliance. The image of harmonious society, where farmers tilled the soil under a benevolent sun and workers sang as they built temples, was a myth maintained through fear. The true mechanisms of control were less poetic. They lived in the overseer's staff, in the branding iron, in exile, in erasure. For those assigned to state projects, construction of royal tombs, expansion of irrigation systems, harvesting for the temples, attendance was not optional, nor was fatigue an acceptable excuse. From the moment a man's name was inscribed on a labor list, his body no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the task. Refusal, even subtle, was met swiftly. A missed day. A delay in a delivery, a slowed pace. These could trigger punishments both immediate and lingering. Whipping was common. its marks both warning and record. A back marked with raised scars was as much an administrative note as a disciplinary act. It showed others what would happen if they too hesitated. In more severe cases, branding was used. A hot iron pressed against the skin, usually on the arm, back, or sometimes the face. The pain was sharp, but the message lasted a lifetime. The branded worker became both a warning and a pariah. His presence reminded others of the costs of disobedience. His body became a walking decree, labor or suffer. There were those who disappeared, removed from their villages, taken to labor camps in remote quarries or border outposts. These exiles were rarely documented, and if they died, and many did, their deaths passed unnoticed by all but their families, who were left without explanation or justice. Women, too, faced punishment, though theirs was often less visible. A woman who refused to grind grain, to prepare food for temple feasts, to serve in the household of a priest, might be deprived of food herself. She could be isolated, humiliated, or denied access to water. In some cases, her children were taken, placed into temple service, or sold into bonded labor as repayment for her failure. Children born into poor families were conditioned early. The punishment for disobedience was not always violent. It could be neglect, hunger, cold. A boy who delayed in fetching water might find his ration reduced. A girl who spilled flour might be made to sleep outside. These were lessons in control, learned not in schools, but in the small, merciless rituals of daily life. Religion, once again, provided a script for this order. The gods demanded obedience. The pharaoh, as the living embodiment of divine will, required it. And the overseers, armed with staffs, commands, and sacred justification, enforced it. To question labor was to question the gods themselves. Even rest had to be sanctioned. During massive building projects, workers were required to stand for long hours without sitting. To kneel or lean was seen as disrespect. Some sites implemented a rule of silence: no speaking during work hours, no sharing of complaints. Conversation was seen as a distraction from duty. And those caught breaking these rules risked more than reprimand. They risked the whip, the brand, or worse, removal from the labor lists entirely, which often meant starvation. There were few safe spaces. The home, even when it offered brief relief, was not immune. Husbands who failed at work might take their frustration out on their families. Mothers who were beaten might teach their daughters silence, not for peace, but for survival. The violence filtered down, not because people were cruel by nature, but because they were trying to survive a world that rewarded cruelty with stability. What makes these punishments particularly brutal is their invisibility. They were not recorded in grand decrees or etched into monuments. They were passed through generations as habits, warnings, memories, a whispered story at night, a scar hidden beneath linen, a lesson taught in lowered voices. To refuse work was not only to risk pain, it was to risk being erased from the thin margins of protection that society offered. It meant losing access to food, to water, to ritual, to safety. And so most did not refuse. They bowed their heads, they carried the load, they bit back the scream. In the great silence of Egyptian history, these punishments echo faintly. They are not found in statues, but in absence, in the empty corners of the tombs, in the lack of names. In the quiet obedience that built an empire not only of stone, but of fear. In a land where the sun governed every movement and molded every structure, it was both sustainer and destroyer. Its light brought crops to life, guided the rhythms of work, and illuminated the faces of gods carved in stone. But for those who lived beneath it daily, without shade, without shelter, without reprieve, the sun was no benign deity. It was an indifferent punisher. And for many, one of its most cruel legacies was blindness. Ceguera precoce, early onset loss of sight, was not uncommon among Egypt's laboring poor. It was not the result of disease alone, nor of injury, but of relentless exposure. In fields that stretched for miles, in quarries that shimmered with reflected glare, in cities constructed of pale limestone and whitewashed mud brick, the sun was not only overhead, it was everywhere, bouncing from surface to surface, entering eyes that had no defense. The modern concept of protection, hats, veils, tinted glass, did not exist for the common worker. Some covered their heads with scraps of cloth, but this provided little against the brilliance. Their eyes, day after day, faced the burn of ultraviolet light, the drying heat of open air, the sting of windborne sand. The very environment was a constant assault on vision. Eye injuries were a daily hazard. Dust storms stirred from the desert pushed particles into the air, fine enough to evade the body's defenses, sharp enough to scratch corneas. Farmers squinted against the glare while sowing and reaping, rubbing their eyes with callous, dusty hands. Stonecutters watched the sun reflect off chiseled surfaces for hours. Children carried water beneath open skies, looking upward to avoid stumbling, absorbing the brightness until it etched itself into their vision. There are few written records of blindness in ancient Egypt, but the signs are there, hidden in depictions of figures with drooping eyelids, in the medical papyri that mention eye ointments and surgeries, in the amulets meant to protect sight. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers. Papyrus, both famed medical texts, devote sections to eye diseases describing redness, irritation, and total loss of vision. Their remedies range from honey salves to prayers, from applications of ground minerals to spells invoked under the moonlight. But these treatments were rarely accessible to the poor. Most went blind without intervention, their sight fading with each year of toil. Blindness often arrived before old age. Men in their 30s, already worn down by 2 decades of labor, began to stumble. They stopped recognizing faces in the dim twilight of their homes. They leaned more heavily on others. Some withdrew from work entirely, unable to perform, and thus considered useless. In a society where worth was measured by productivity, blindness could render a person socially invisible as well. There was no system of support, no pension, no care. Those who lost their sight relied on the charity of family, on the grudging tolerance of overseers, or on the slim hope of being reassigned to less demanding tasks. Some were sent to temples, where they performed ritual duties or served as beggars outside sacred gates. Others were abandoned, their blindness regarded not as misfortune, but as burden. The symbolic resonance of eyes in Egyptian culture only deepens the tragedy. The Eye of Horus, a central symbol of protection, health, and power, appears everywhere, in tombs, on jewelry, carved into amulets, buried with the dead. Eyes were sacred. They were the pathway to the gods. To lose sight was, in a spiritual sense, to lose favor. And yet, the reality stood in stark contrast. The very sun that represented divine radiance also took away the light of life for so many, not as punishment, not as judgment, but simply as consequence. As the slow, indifferent result of working every day beneath an unforgiving sky. In the silence of archaeological records, blindness leaves few marks. It does not scar the bones, it does not carve itself into stone, but in the oral traditions, in the quiet myths, in the patterns of abandonment and adaptation, it lingers. A man led by his son, a woman touching walls to find her way, a worker no longer called to the fields. This, too, was Egypt, a place where light blinded. Where vision faded long before wisdom arrived, and where the gift of the gods, the sun itself, took more than it gave. There is a kind of silence found only underground, a silence heavy with a weight of stone, of history, of breath held too long. In the mines and quarries of ancient Egypt, this silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. It was the sound of bodies pushing against the earth's resistance, the sound of coughing in narrow corridors, of footsteps echoing off rock that would never see the sun. Mining in Egypt was not a profession, it was a sentence. Many who entered these shafts did so not by choice, but by command. They were slaves, conscripts, or laborers too poor to refuse. They descended into the dark to extract what others would polish into symbols of eternity: copper, gold, semi-precious stones, quartzite, limestone. The beauty of Egyptian jewelry, the brilliance of sacred inlays, the gleam of sarcophagi, all of it was born from dust, and all of it came at a cost. The conditions were brutal beyond modern comparison. Miners worked in cramped tunnels carved into cliffs or dug beneath the surface, sometimes forced to crawl for hours just to reach the chamber where the real labor began. The air inside was dry and acrid. Torches burned with flickering light, their smoke clinging to the walls and lungs alike. Ventilation was nearly non-existent. Breathing was a labor in itself. And always there was the dust. The earth in these regions, especially in the eastern desert and Sinai, was fine and dry. As stone was chipped away, it turned to particles that hung in the air, invisible but lethal. Workers inhaled this dust with every breath. Day after day, year after year, their lungs filled with what they were sent to remove. Modern science has a name for it: silicosis, a disease caused by the inhalation of silica particles, leading to inflammation and scarring of the lungs. In the ancient world, there was no diagnosis, no terminology. Just the slow closing of airways, the persistent cough, the blood-streaked phlegm, the shallow breath that eventually stopped altogether. Skeletal remains found near ancient mining sites show signs of respiratory stress: enlarged rib cages, abnormal bone growths near the chest, signs of chronic infection. But these are rare. Most miners were not buried in places where they would be remembered. They died far from their homes, interred hastily in the desert soil, or not at all. Their stories were left not in writing, but in the absence of breath. There were no protective garments, no tools to filter the air. Miners wore the same linen they used above ground, if they wore anything at all. Their hands were calloused from chisel and hammer. Their backs bent from lifting baskets filled with fragments of stone. Their eyes stung from dust and smoke, and their chests tightened with each passing day until breath itself became an act of suffering. Supervisors did not linger in the mines. They stayed near the entrances or at the surface, barking orders, counting loads. Those inside were left to their own rhythms, slow, methodical, driven not by time, but by necessity. To produce was to survive. To falter was to be replaced. Some tried to protect themselves, wetting a cloth and tying it over the nose and mouth, turning away from the heaviest clouds, breathing shallowly when the dust thickened. But these were gestures, not solutions. The air itself was the enemy, and there was no escaping it. Outside the mines, the sun scorched. Inside, the heat built from within, rising off the stone, trapping breath. Miners emerged with faces coated in gray, their mouths dry, their voices hoarse. At night, many could not sleep for coughing. In the morning, some could not stand. And yet, the labor went on. The stone would not free itself. The gold would not shine on its own. To those who commissioned temples, who wore amulets, who drank from goblets inlaid with turquoise, these mines were distant abstractions. They saw only the final product, the gleaming surface. The hands that bled to produce it were hidden deep in the hills. But beneath every polished surface of Egypt's treasures lies a shadow, a breath stolen by dust, a life shortened by labor, a cough that never stopped. The sand which blanketed the land in beauty also invaded the most intimate space of the body. The lungs became tombs before the person ever died, and the mine, that narrow wound in the earth, was both workplace and grave. This too is part of Egypt's memory, a civilization that rose from the desert and demanded in return the breath of those who dared dig too deep. Nightfall in ancient Egypt was not a time of peace. It was not a curtain drawn to separate labor from rest, nor a quiet return to comfort after the punishing demands of the sun. For many, the night brought a different kind of fear, one not shaped by overseers or hunger, but by the crawling, slithering, stinging presence of the desert itself. To sleep was to surrender. And in the fragile spaces where the poor laid their heads, danger did not rest. The homes of laborers, farmers, and slaves were simple, often made of sun-dried mud brick. Some were single-room dwellings, others part of communal housing near work sites or state-run projects. Roofs were flat or slightly domed, sometimes missing altogether. The walls, cracked by heat and time, offered little protection from the elements or from the creatures that shared the land. Scorpions and snakes were not strangers to these spaces. They lived beneath rocks, within storage piles, among firewood, and in the crevices of walls. By day, they hid from the heat. By night, they hunted. Their movement was silent, their appearance sudden. A hand placed carelessly on the ground, a foot stepping from the bed, a child rolling in sleep. These were all invitations. In the dry heat of the desert, scorpions thrive. Their venom varies by species, but in ancient Egypt, even a minor sting could lead to agony. More dangerous bites, especially from species common near the Nile Valley, caused fever, vomiting, convulsions, and in children, often death. Snakes, too, haunted the night. The horned viper, the Egyptian cobra. Their presence was more than a biological hazard. It was a spiritual omen. In mythology, serpents represented chaos. In reality, they brought it. There was no glass to close a window, no screens, no sealant. Mats were laid on dirt floors. Blankets, if owned, were thin and infested. People slept near livestock, near each other, in tight, hot spaces where breathing itself was strained. And in these spaces, the presence of a scorpion was not rare. It was expected. Archaeological evidence includes warnings painted on walls, amulets designed to protect sleepers from venomous bites, and household charms invoking divine guardianship. The goddess Serket, often depicted with a scorpion atop her head, was called upon for protection. Mothers whispered her name while pressing their children's eyes shut at dusk. But prayers were no barrier to fangs. Medical papyri offer remedies, poultices of herbs, incantations to drive poison back into the earth, chants murmured over ash and honey, but these were often inaccessible to the poor. Temples held the knowledge, but rarely shared it freely. Most treated stings with water, mud, pressure, whatever instinct or desperation suggested. The results were uneven. Survivors bore scars. Victims often did not survive at all. Sleep, which should have been a refuge, became a risk. Parents sat awake long into the night, listening for the hiss, the click, the sudden rustle. They taught their children to shake out sandals in the morning, to never reach blindly, to cover their mouths and noses while they slept. These rituals were not superstition. They were born from loss. There is something profoundly unsettling in imagining a family gathered at dusk, exhausted from labor, knowing that rest itself could bring danger. No locks, no light. No walls thick enough to guarantee safety. just breath held in the dark, ears straining against the wind. The elite slept in stone homes, raised beds with servants nearby, and oils burning in bronze lamps. The poor slept in shadow, in heat, in fear. Their dreams interrupted not by noise, but by venom. Even the myths reflect this tension. The story of Isis saving her son Horus from a scorpion sting was more than religious tale. It was a mirror of nightly anxiety. Divine intervention was yearned for because human defenses were so fragile. In the collective memory of Egypt, the scorpion and the snake were more than pests. They were reminders that life was delicate, that suffering came not only from labor or hunger or state decree, but from the very land itself. That even in sleep, especially in sleep, there was no true rest. And so every dawn brought not only a new day of toil, but a silent tally of those who had made it through the night. Another breath, another spared child, another body not found stiff with venom. This too was part of ancient life. The understanding that the darkness did not protect, that stillness did not guarantee peace, and that in a world ruled by heat and hunger, even the right to sleep was something that could be stolen, quietly, in the dark, with a single sting. In the dry, shimmering light of ancient Egypt, childhood did not unfold as a season of innocence. It was not protected by walls of leisure, nor cradled in long years of play and exploration. For the majority of children born into poor or enslaved families, life began with labor. By the age of 5, many were already considered useful, not for their potential, but for their hands, their backs, their ability to carry water, to fetch wood, to obey. Childhood in ancient Egypt was sharply divided by class. The sons and daughters of nobility were often educated, adorned in fine linen, attended by servants. They learned to read, to recite hymns, to compose poetry or calculate land boundaries. Their games were documented in tomb paintings, spinning tops, board games, toy animals. Their laughter, preserved in art, suggests a life of relative ease. But for the children of the laboring class, the picture was different. Their toys, if they had any, were made from discarded fragments, bits of pottery, woven scraps of palm. Their learning began not in schools, but in fields, kitchens, workshops. They followed their parents into labor, watching first, then mimicking, then joining. A child of 5 might be seen carrying water from the river, the pot nearly as large as their torso. Another might trail behind older siblings, gathering sticks for fuel. Some learned to grind grain with their mothers, turning stones that wore down their palms and shoulders long before adolescence. Others were taken to work sites where they fetched tools, held ropes, brushed away debris. There are tomb reliefs that show small children among laborers, not as symbolic figures, but as part of the workforce. Their smallness was practical. They could reach into narrow spaces, climb where others could not, fit beneath low scaffolding. Their value lay in their malleability and in the fact that they did not yet resist. In communities tied to temples or large estates, children were often registered for duty alongside their parents. They might begin in domestic service, cleaning, sweeping, assisting in food preparation. Over time, their responsibilities grew. Some were groomed for roles within temple economies, while others were simply absorbed into the grinding wheel of menial labor. The effects were immediate and lasting. Forensic examinations of juvenile skeletons reveal growth delays, signs of malnutrition, and stress fractures, consistent with physical exertion far beyond what the body should bear at such a young age. Some show curvature of the spine, compressed vertebrae, or overdeveloped areas in the knees and elbows from repeated lifting and squatting. Others carry the evidence of trauma, broken bones poorly healed, teeth worn down by grit, early signs of arthritis. Beyond the body, the emotional landscape was marked by silence. Childhood was not a protected phase, but a preparatory one. Boys learned to endure, girls learned to serve. There was little space for dreaming. Their questions were met with instructions, their tears with shrugs or scoldings. Affection, when given, was often brief, hurried, practical, wrapped in warnings shaped by hardship. And yet, within these constraints, children found slivers of humanity, a brother sharing a fig, a moment of laughter while working beside a friend, a game invented with stones in the dust. These were not signs of flourishing, but of resilience, a stubborn refusal, however brief, to be completely consumed by obligation. Some children died before they reached 10. Their deaths were not unusual and rarely recorded. The causes were many: heat stroke, accidents, infection, malnutrition. Their graves, when marked at all, were simple: shallow pits, a bit of cloth, a stone, no name, no record. Just absence. Others grew into adults who had no memory of ease. Their backs bore the imprint of a childhood spent working, their minds shaped by the repetition of tasks. Some became overseers themselves, repeating the cycle. Others remained laborers until death, having known only toil since their earliest memory. In Egyptian society, the divine order did not include a childhood right to freedom. A child's body was an extension of the family's function. And in a state that demanded ceaseless output from its people, even the smallest among them were summoned into service. This was not cruelty as exception. It was cruelty as structure, normalized, expected, forgotten. And so, in the long golden arc of Egyptian history, as dynasties rose and fell, as kings inscribed their victories into stone, the children remained, small figures in the shadow of monuments, lifting, carrying, waiting, not yet grown, but already burdened. Not yet named in the records, but already exhausted, they remind us that childhood, as we now imagine it, is a privilege of time and place, and that for most of human history, including the heart of one of its most celebrated civilizations, childhood was not a chapter. It was a task, a beginning marked not by wonder, but by work. In the grand narrative of ancient Egypt, where gods bore the faces of men and the names of queens glimmered rarely but brightly in gold and legend, the women of the working class existed largely in silence, not because they were absent, but because their presence was so constant, so essential, so deeply embedded in the rhythm of survival, that it was rarely seen as exceptional. They did not command armies, inscribe decrees, or build monuments to their names. But they built something else, the foundation upon which daily life rested. A woman in ancient Egypt was born not to be remembered, but to serve. Her value was measured not in status, but in function. From early girlhood, her life was structured by tasks. She learned to grind grain, fetch water, knead dough, weave linen, care for siblings. She learned the language of silence, when to obey, when to endure. Her body was not her own. It was a vessel of labor, of reproduction, of duty. At dawn, while her husband or brother prepared to leave for the fields or the temple site, she was already at work. The fire needed to be kindled, the flatbread shaped and baked on clay tiles, the water fetched from distant wells or the river's edge, the children cleaned, dressed, kept from danger. The home, no matter how humble, demanded attention. In summer heat and winter chill, she moved constantly, tending, mending, lifting, carrying. Pregnancy was frequent. Childbearing was expected. Contraception, where practiced, was rudimentary and unreliable. Many women bore more than 6 children in their lifetimes, and many of those children did not survive infancy. Childbirth without trained medical care was a moment of intense vulnerability. Women gave birth on bricks or in crouched positions, often alone or assisted by neighbors. The risks were immense: hemorrhage, infection, prolonged labor. Death in childbirth was common, and when it came, it was quiet. No priest marked her passing, no ceremony carved her name. Yet even after such loss, life continued. Another child to feed, another meal to prepare, another pot to carry. Archaeological remains tell us much that written records ignore. The skeletons of women show pelvic injuries consistent with repeated childbirth under duress, spinal compression from years of carrying water jars, joint degeneration in the knees and wrists from hours spent grinding grain or squatting at hearths. Their teeth, worn down by coarse bread and the grit of stone-ground flour, speak of years of nourishment given to others, withheld from themselves. In times of famine, it was often the women who ate last. When food was scarce, their bodies thinned. And yet, they continued. They worked not for recognition, but because no one else would. They labored through grief, through exhaustion, through pain. The emotional world of these women remains largely hidden. We do not have their letters, their journals, their prayers. What we have are clues: a scrap of woven cloth, a comb made of bone, a broken doll left in the corner of a child's grave. We imagine their sorrows because they left no words to describe them, but the patterns repeat. Children buried too young, sisters dying before 20, friends lost in childbirth, and always life moving on. Women were not absent from religion, but their roles were limited. Goddesses of fertility, of protection, of healing, they represented ideals, not lived realities. While queens and high priestesses appear in carvings, the everyday woman did not. She was not depicted beside the gods. She was behind the scenes, feeding the priests, washing the linens of sacred statues, cleaning the courtyards of temples she could not enter. In some rare cases, women worked outside the home: brewers, midwives, mourners, dancers. But even these roles were shaped by service, not by status. Their labor supported the rituals of others. Their presence remained conditional, never central. There were moments of agency: a mother naming a child, a widow defending her home, a midwife saving a life. These were powerful acts, but unrecorded. History does not remember them. Yet they shaped the very society that history seeks to describe. The invisibility of these women was not accidental. It was structural. A result of a world built on hierarchies of worth, where visibility was reserved for the few and labor for the many. But their absence from the record is not absence from the truth. They were there, kneeling at the grindstone, lifting the infant, holding the dying child, carrying firewood, mourning in silence, surviving. They were the breath between the chisel strikes, the hands behind the meals that fueled the builders of pyramids, the arms that held generations, the feet that never stopped moving. They were indispensable, and yet invisible until now. Amid the towering monuments and intricate tombs of ancient Egypt, among the symbols of eternity carved in gold and stone, was a truth much harder, much coarser to digest. The bodies that built the glory of Egypt were rarely nourished by it. While the temples stored wealth in jars and granaries swelled beneath the careful eyes of scribes, the people who sustained the empire with their backs and hands ate not in abundance, but in scarcity. The diet of an Egyptian laborer was shaped by availability, by social rank, and most of all, by necessity. Food was fuel, not pleasure. It was a calculation, just enough to keep the body moving, never enough to let it rest. Bread formed the core of the daily meal. But this was not soft, fluffy bread. It was dense, dry, coarse, made from emmer wheat or barley, ground with hand stones that left behind not just flour, but fragments of grit and stone. Over time, the consumption of this gritty bread wore down the teeth of workers, leading to infections, abscesses, and chronic pain. Some skulls found in workers' cemeteries show jaws so deteriorated that the simple act of eating must have been agony. Alongside the bread came onions and garlic, sharp, pungent, hardy crops that thrived even when harvests failed. These were not condiments, they were staples. Raw or cooked, they filled the stomach and masked the hunger that came from lack of fat or protein. Legumes like lentils and chickpeas occasionally supplemented the diet, but only when stores allowed. The same with dried dates or figs, precious sources of sugar but unevenly distributed. Salted fish caught from the Nile might appear on a better day, but meat, true meat, was a rarity, reserved for feast days, temple sacrifices, or the tables of the elite. Animal protein was scarce not just due to cost, but because animals were more valuable alive. Oxen were needed to plow. Goats and sheep produced milk. Chickens and ducks laid eggs, which were sometimes consumed, more often sold or traded. Milk and cheese did exist, but were perishable and not always safe. Fermentation and spoilage were constant risks in the heat. Water, drawn from the river or wells, was often cloudy, laden with sediment or contaminants. Boiling it required fuel, which was in itself a resource to be rationed. Beer, surprisingly, was common, but not the beer of modern taverns. It was thick, more like porridge than liquid, clouded with yeast, often containing bits of grain, and low in alcohol. It was a staple more than a beverage, providing both hydration and calories. Even children drank it. It filled bellies, dulled pain, softened the edge of a hunger that never truly left. During times of shortage, when the Nile failed or when the state diverted grain to religious centers or royal projects, the diet grew even more dire. Ground acacia seeds, roasted papyrus root, cakes made from clay mixed with chaff. Survival foods eaten not for taste, not for tradition, but for endurance. The archaeological record confirms this bleak menu. Mummified remains of non-elite Egyptians often show signs of nutritional stress. Bowed bones, porous skulls, stunted growth. Iron deficiency anemia, visible in the marrow of long bones, was common. Some bodies were buried with nothing more than a clay bowl beside them, perhaps their only possession. What is striking is not just what these people ate, but how often they did not eat enough. Meals were few, small, and uneven. Fasting was not ritual, it was reality. Hunger, a companion as familiar as the sun, and yet they worked. They lifted stones, hauled baskets, baked bricks, served in silence. Even in death, their food tells a story. Unlike the nobles, who were buried with jars of honey, baskets of fruit, slabs of meat, wrapped for eternity, the poor were buried with little or nothing. No feasts for the afterlife, no banquets imagined in tomb walls. Just the body, worn thin by labor, stilled at last. And so we remember them, not only by what they built, but by what they ate, by the roughness of their bread, the bitterness of their greens, the quiet hunger that defined their days and shaped their bones. Egypt's greatness rose not just on the backs of its workers, but on the crumbs they were allowed to keep. Theirs was a diet not of glory, but of survival, measured in handfuls, in shadows, in silence. In ancient Egypt, death was not the end. It was a continuation, a transition, a carefully orchestrated passage into a realm more permanent and orderly than life itself. The dead were not merely remembered, they were venerated, prepared, adorned, protected. Their bodies were embalmed, their names preserved, their tombs filled with tokens, tools, and texts. For the elite, death was a second birth, a ritual rebirth into eternity. But while the dead were meticulously honored, the living who sustained this machinery of remembrance were often ignored, exhausted, underfed, and forgotten. This paradox shaped Egyptian civilization. At its heart was a profound reverence for the afterlife, but that reverence required labor, and the labor demanded sacrifice from those who would never receive the same honors in death. The pyramids, those colossal symbols of eternal order, consumed entire generations. Temples grew fat with offerings while the granaries of villages emptied. Gold leaf was pressed onto the eyelids of pharaohs while the eyes of the poor went blind from dust and sun. The resources poured into funerary architecture were staggering. Stone quarried hundreds of miles away was transported across desert and river. Artisans spent lifetimes carving tomb reliefs, painting ceilings with stars, and inscribing spells that would protect the deceased from hunger, darkness, and decay. Yet outside those tombs, real hunger, real darkness, real decay spread among the laboring poor. Mortuary temples required constant maintenance. Priests performed daily rituals long after a king's death. Offerings of bread, meat, beer, incense, and cloth were presented not once, but continuously. But who baked that bread? Who raised the animals, brewed the beer, wove the linen? The answer is always the same: those who were still alive, but barely living. In times of scarcity, the state protected the offerings to the dead before feeding the living. Grain reserved for temple rituals was not distributed to the starving. The needs of the eternal outweighed the cries of the present. A system that promised eternity for a few required constant suffering from the many. Even in death, the division remained. The elite were mummified, entombed, and remembered. The poor were wrapped in simple cloth or buried directly in sand. No grave markers, no spells, no goods. Their journey into the afterlife, if imagined at all, was a silent one. The fields of reeds, Egypt's paradise, were filled with the wealthy, and their servants depicted joyfully harvesting grain or boating down clear waters. But the servants drawn in these scenes were not given names. They were decorative, eternalized only as functions of elite comfort. The religion that embraced death so tenderly often treated life with indifference. Not because it was cruel, but because it was ordered. Everything had its place. The pharaoh was divine, the priest sacred, the laborer necessary. Suffering was normalized, absorbed into cosmic balance. Even injustice could be framed as divine will, and so the system perpetuated itself. Workers built tombs that dwarfed their own homes. Families wove shrouds they would never afford for themselves. The smell of resin and incense filled the air, while the scent of rot lingered in villages without clean water or rest. This was not hypocrisy, it was belief. Deep, sincere, unyielding belief. And perhaps that is what makes it so haunting. The Egyptians feared being forgotten after death. They feared the erasure of their names, the loss of their voices. And yet they allowed countless lives to vanish, unrecorded, unnamed, so that others might speak forever from the tomb. What does it mean to build eternity while your own days are counted in pain, to carry the sarcophagus of a king while your own children die unnamed in shallow graves? In Egypt, death was sacred, but it was not fair, and the living, those who made death so beautiful, were left behind in hunger, in dust, in silence. They did not carve their names into stone. They did not inscribe prayers for immortality, but they existed. Their breath filled the chambers of pyramids. Their footprints wore paths into temple floors. Their tears mixed with mortar. Their lives, though forgotten, are embedded in every corner of the eternal. And it is only by listening to their silence that we begin to understand the full story. Not just of what was built, but of what it cost. Not only of how Egypt honored its dead, but of how it overlooked its living. The sun in ancient Egypt was more than a source of light. It was a force that dictated movement, reshaped time, and carved its authority into the very bones of those who lived beneath it. Its presence was constant, its intensity unrelenting. Every aspect of life was shaped in response to it, not just the architecture of homes or the timing of prayers, but the daily rituals of the body, the structure of labor, and the form of survival itself. For the elite, the sun was a symbol of divine power, of eternal order, of royal brilliance. But for the working class, it was something else. It was a weight pressing down on every moment. It was a silent oppressor, deforming not only schedules but physiology. The heat was not an environmental condition, it was an authority. The routine of the poor was dictated by light and temperature. Work began before dawn, when the world was still dim and the air had not yet thickened. As the sun rose, bodies moved faster, racing against the mounting heat. Tasks that required lifting, hauling, plowing, or baking were performed early, because by midday the air turned viscous. The light became blinding. The skin began to blister, breath grew short, and still the work continued. In many settlements, particularly those near temples or royal estates, the schedule was broken not by hours, but by the sun's position. Shade became a moving destination. Entire communities adapted their behavior to avoid the worst of the day, though only when allowed. For most workers, reprieve was not permitted. They were exposed by design, by expectation, by disregard. The long-term effects of this exposure are inscribed in skeletal remains. Many laborers show signs of heat-induced stress disorders, spines compressed from dehydration, cartilage worn thin from repetitive movement in dry, mineral-depleting environments, skull deformities consistent with long-term sunstroke and fainting injuries, teeth fractured by grinding and clenching, a silent response to endless fatigue. The skin, unpreserved in most remains, suffered daily, blistering, cracking, peeling. Over time, layers thickened, darkened, hardened, not from adaptation but from endurance. Lips split under the sun, eyes burned from constant squinting. Children exposed from infancy, aged quickly, their posture stooped by 12, their joints swollen before adolescence. Clothing, when available, was no shield. Linen garments were light but offered little defense against heat. They clung damp to the body, then dried stiff with sweat and dust. Many worked barefoot. Their soles, calloused and cracked, bled in silence across sun-baked stones. Water, essential for survival, was both precious and rationed. Carried in jars from rivers or wells, it was often warm, often shared, and often insufficient. Dehydration was not occasional, it was chronic. Those who collapsed were not tended to, they were judged. Weakness was equated with disobedience, and the rituals of daily life mirrored this harsh reality. Meals were short, dry, taken in silence. Rest was measured in moments. Families organized themselves around the heat, reserving energy not for conversation or affection, but for survival. Children were bathed before dawn. Bread was baked in the earliest hours. Laundry done in near darkness. Every act anticipated the sun's climb. But even religion, that great source of cosmic rhythm, bowed to the heat. Festivals were scheduled with the seasons in mind. Ceremonies held in shaded courtyards. Prayers whispered quickly beneath the glare. The gods themselves were wrapped in cloths to protect their effigies from damage by heat and light. And yet, their human worshippers, especially the poor, were offered no such protection. Over time, entire bodies bore the imprint of this climate. Hips rotated outward from long hours of squatting, shoulders rounded from carrying loads that stuck close to the body to avoid wind and sun. The gait of laborers adapted to heat, shorter strides, more shuffling. conserving every breath, every drop of sweat. Sweat was not only a function, it was a language. It marked effort, it marked failure. Those who didn't sweat were feared, close to collapse. Those who sweated too much were mocked, inefficient, clumsy, overexerting, and always sweat was loss. Salt leached from the body, muscles cramped, minds clouded, even dreams shifted. In overheated rooms where breath turned thick and walls radiated warmth into the night, sleep was fractured. People dreamt of water, of cool stone, of walking through shadows that never moved. They dreamt of things they would never feel, cold breezes, rain, fog. And still, life continued, not because it was pleasant, but because it had to. The heat shaped Egypt, not only in the sweep of its deserts or the pace of its floods, but in the angles of its backs, the rhythms of its feet, the silence of its suffering. The sun watched everything, and in return, it demanded sweat, silence, surrender. There was no rebellion against heat, only adaptation, only transformation, only the long, slow deformation of the human body into something capable of surviving under its rule. And even then, not all survived. Many broke, quietly. In the light, without witness, without relief. In the imagination of many, temples in ancient Egypt were places of mystery and majesty, where incense curled through sacred halls, where chants echoed beneath columns inscribed with stars, and where gods received offerings with divine indifference. And yet, behind the veils of devotion, behind the doors carved with eternal symbols, the temple could also be something else entirely. It could be a prison. Not one of iron bars, but of obligation, submission, and silence. A place where children were surrendered, where lives were consumed in the name of the divine. The temple was not simply a house of worship. It was a machine of the state. It owned land, managed estates, collected taxes, and governed labor. Its needs were vast, its wealth immense. And to maintain its operations, it required workers, not only priests and scribes, but bakers, brewers, herders, weavers, potters, and cleaners. These roles were often filled not by the devout, but by the indebted. Families in economic desperation would give their children to the temple, not always in reverence, but in repayment. A debt owed to a landowner, a favor unreturned, a tax unmet. The child became compensation, handed over in a transaction cloaked in ritual, yet rooted in poverty. Once inside the temple, the child's fate was sealed not by choice, but by contract. These children, some as young as 6, entered a world that was rigid and impersonal. They were stripped of identity, renamed, redressed. Their former lives dissolved. Their families might see them once more or never again. The temple became parent, teacher, master. For some, this new life brought structure, meals, lodging, a kind of stability. But stability is not freedom. The routines were harsh. Days began before sunrise. Duties varied by age and skill. Younger children cleaned, fetched, learned hymns. Older ones labored. They carried wood, prepared offerings, served the upper clergy, and maintained the spaces most worshipers never saw. There was no space for rebellion. The temple was sacred ground. To question its rules was to question the gods. Discipline was spiritualized, punishment masked as purification. A missed duty might result in flogging. An error in ritual might bring days of isolation. Food withheld, words denied. Silence imposed not for reflection, but for control. Girls were not exempt. They spun linen for divine statues, prepared incense, assisted in rites. Some were designated as sacred virgins, others as temple servants in more physical senses. Their roles were defined by ritual, but their experiences were often shaped by exploitation. Their voices were rarely recorded, Their agency assumed absent. Outside the temple, their absence was felt. A child given to the gods left a gap in the family structure, a missing hand at the mill, a sibling no longer present. And yet, to protest was to blaspheme. The gods had taken what was theirs. Resistance was not only punished, it was unheard. For those who served a lifetime, there was no pension, no compensation, no return to civilian life. Death came within the temple walls, and even then, burial was modest, functional, discreet, unless one had risen far enough within the hierarchy to earn remembrance. Temples proclaimed eternity. Their walls outlasted dynasties. Their rituals continued long after the names of kings faded. But those who kept the rituals alive, the invisible class of bound workers, were swallowed by that same eternity, unnamed, uncelebrated, forgotten. The irony is sharp. Those closest to the gods were often the least free. Their lives were not lived in devotion, but in duty, not shaped by faith, but by the lack of alternatives. And yet, within that system, they survived. They learned to navigate silence, to find small spaces of comfort, a song half sung, a moment of stillness at dawn, a stolen glance at the outside world. They lived within walls that called themselves sacred and bore the weight of a holiness that had no mercy. The temple for the faithful was a place of promise, but for many it was a place of surrender, a beautiful cage lined with incense and guarded by belief. And within it, countless lives passed not in worship, but in quiet servitude. Their hands touched the sacred, their voices recited the divine, but their lives remained always just out of reach of freedom. To build for a king was to labor in the shadow of divinity. The great monuments of ancient Egypt, temples that soared like prayers, tombs carved deep into the earth, colossal statues with eternal gazes, were not the results of inspiration or communal pride. They were forged through discipline, through regulation, through a silence so total, so expected, it became part of the architecture itself. Silence in royal construction sites was not poetic, it was policy. Workers, often assembled from villages, estates, or among the enslaved, were organized into crews, each with defined roles, timings, and duties. Communication existed, but it was controlled, measured in gestures, in glances, in murmurs swallowed by dust. Voices were reserved for commands, for the counting of bricks, for the shouting of warnings, never for stories, never for songs. To speak without permission was to risk punishment. Overseers roamed the scaffolds and quarry paths, not just to monitor productivity, but to enforce stillness. They listened more than they looked. A conversation could be interpreted as distraction, a laugh as defiance, a question as disrespect. And yet, these sites were alive with movement, dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of bodies in coordinated effort. The sound was not human but material, stone scraping stone, chisels tapping, baskets thudding against the earth, sandals dragging across uneven ground. A rhythm of labor, uninterrupted by speech. In this enforced silence, the body became the primary tool of expression. A bent head, a bowed back, a raised eyebrow. Pain was rarely vocalized. A man with a strained shoulder did not groan. A woman carrying clay did not complain. To suffer aloud was to expose oneself. And exposure, in the presence of authority, was dangerous. This silence extended to rest. Breaks, when permitted, were quiet affairs. Workers retreated into shade, sipped from shared jars, chewed hard bread slowly. There were no stories shared of families, no speculation about the pharaoh's afterlife, no idle dreams. Only breathing, only recovery, only watching the sun crawl across the sky. The hierarchy was reinforced by this control of sound. The architects and scribes, educated and elite, spoke freely. They issued orders in full voice. They recorded progress with ink and pride. But those who lifted, carved, mixed, and hauled, their words were not preserved. Their names, when noted, were appended with numbers, rolls, and rotations, not personalities, not memories. And when something went wrong, a mismeasured block, a crack in the stone, a delay in delivery, the silence deepened. Blame descended fast. The guilty, or merely the unlucky, might be beaten, removed, replaced. No defense could be spoken, no justification heard. Silence was the standard. It was both shield and muzzle. Religious ideology bolstered this atmosphere. Temples were built not just for gods, but by God's command. The pharaoh, as divine ruler, demanded perfection. To disrupt the building process with noise was seen as contaminating the sanctity of the work. Sound, uncontrolled, was chaos. And chaos was the enemy of Ma'at, the cosmic order Egypt so cherished. Even in death, silence was expected. Workers who died on the job were buried quickly, often nearby, with little ceremony. Their labor acknowledged only by the stone they helped place. Their voices lost forever beneath the structure they helped raise. But within this silence, there was also endurance, the shared understanding that each gesture mattered. That in a world without applause, without recognition, effort still shaped the future. That beneath the weight of stone and silence, a kind of collective will endured. The monuments still stand. Their silence is often described as awe-inspiring. But few visitors imagine the quieter silences, the ones that pulsed beneath sun and stone enforced by fear, carved by discipline, the silences that kept order, that kept workers anonymous. That allowed the divine to rise while the human remained buried, unheard. And so the next time we gaze upon a towering obelisk or a temple wall covered in gods, we might listen differently, not just to the grandeur of what was built, but to the silence of those who built it, a silence heavier than stone and just as lasting. The bodies of Egypt's laboring poor bore not only the weight of stone and sun, but also the slow, invisible grip of disease. In a land of towering temples and elaborate medical papyri, the vast majority of the population lived and died far from the reach of any true care. For the workers who tilled the fields, hauled the bricks, and served the great estates, sickness was not an event. It was a condition, a state of being woven into every gesture, every breath, every ache, left untreated. Parasites thrived in the waters of the Nile and in the stagnant irrigation canals. Schistosomiasis, a disease caused by parasitic worms, was rampant. It entered through bare feet, through the skin, making its way into the bloodstream. It caused swelling, pain, fatigue. In its chronic form, it could damage the liver, the bladder, even the brain. Most never knew its name. They only felt the weakening, the slow erosion of strength, the mysterious fevers that never fully left. Intestinal parasites were also common. Roundworms, tapeworms, and flukes fed silently on the nutrients of those who were already underfed. Children suffered the most. Bloated bellies, stunted growth, constant hunger. Adults learned to live with discomfort, with irregular bowels, with the gnawing pain of something inside them stealing what little food they had managed to eat. Infections festered in wounds left untreated, a scrape from a chisel, a burn from the sun-heated stone, a cut from a papyrus stalk. Without antiseptics, without soap, without rest, small injuries became swollen abscesses. Some drained and healed, others spread. In a body weakened by labor, infection was a quiet killer. Respiratory illness was another constant. The dust of the quarries, the sand whipped by wind, the smoke of cooking fires in enclosed homes, all of it entered the lungs. Some coughed for years, Others developed chronic bronchitis. In advanced cases, the lungs hardened, breath grew short. Death came not with a sudden gasp, but with a slow fading of oxygen. The bones tell this story most clearly. Skeletal remains of non-elite Egyptians show signs of chronic stress: bent femurs, eroded vertebrae, twisted joints. Many skulls show evidence of sinus infections that spread into the bone. Teeth are worn, cracked, or missing. Jaws show signs of abscesses that would have made chewing unbearable. And then there were the mental ailments. Though unnamed, though undiagnosed, they surely existed. The toll of constant labor, of grief without pause, of fear without remedy, these left marks that were not carved in stone but in behavior. A withdrawn child, a man who no longer spoke, a woman who flinched at every raised voice. Trauma accumulated in silence. Access to healing was unequal. Temples housed physicians, trained in both herbal remedies and spiritual healing, but these were not for everyone. The poor rarely saw a healer unless they were attached to a temple estate or a royal project. Their remedies were inherited. Recipes passed from mother to daughter, whispered in the dark. Garlic for fever, mud for burns, ashes for wounds. Some worked, some did not. The idea of health as a right did not exist. The sick worked as long as they could. When they could no longer stand, they rested. And when rest turned into death, the body was wrapped quickly, buried quietly, replaced by another. Even childbirth, a moment of hope, carried danger. Women died from bleeding, from prolonged labor, from infection. Newborns failed to thrive, and yet the cycle repeated. Life insisted, work demanded, death waited. This was the health system of ancient Egypt, not one of prevention, not one of cure, but one of endurance. A system where the body was expected to function until it failed, where the spirit was left to cope alone, where the greatest cure was often time, and time was a luxury no one had. The monuments may stand forever, but the people who built them lived briefly, carried not by medicine, but by necessity. Their pain was not written in papyri. It was written in their bones, their breath, their silences, and it remains just beneath the surface of every stone they touched. In the long silence that blankets the laboring history of ancient Egypt, there is a rare rupture, a moment not of myth or monument, but of breath withheld, of footsteps paused, of hunger finally spoken aloud. A moment when obedience gave way to quiet refusal. It happened not in the court of a king or the heart of a battlefield, but in a small village, cradled by cliffs and carved into the sun-baked rock beyond the Valley of the Kings. A village named Deir el-Medina, built for workers. Known for silence, and remembered for defiance. It was here, in this isolated enclave of skilled artisans, that the first recorded labor strike in human history unfolded. Not with banners or chants or the clash of weapons, but with the slow, deliberate setting down of tools. With the refusal to carve one more symbol of eternity on stone that had never fed their stomachs. The workers of Deir el-Medina were not ordinary laborers. They were craftsmen entrusted with the construction of pharaohs' tombs, painters, stone carvers, plasterers, scribes. They lived apart from the common fields, close to the sacred ground of royal burial. Their lives were regimented, structured, carefully monitored. In return, they were promised food, oil, beer, cloth, enough to survive, not to flourish. But something broke. It was during the reign of Ramses III, a time already shadowed by instability. Supplies had faltered. Grain shipments, carefully scheduled and essential, were delayed. Days passed, then weeks. Empty bowls were filled with silence. Children waited for bread that never arrived. And still the work was expected to continue. The gods required their tombs, The dead demanded their passage. The living were ignored. And so one morning, they did not go to the tomb. They gathered instead at the entrance to the Valley of the Kings, the sacred necropolis, not shouting, not demanding, simply standing together, refusing to give more of themselves to a system that gave so little in return. It was not a single moment, but a series of slow, accumulating refusals. Over the course of several days, the artisans staged what we would now call sit-ins. They walked to temples, not to pray, but to be seen. They positioned themselves outside administrative offices, not to threaten, but to exist visibly. They left written appeals, calm and desperate, declaring their hunger, their exhaustion, their betrayal. They were not asking for luxury, only for what had been promised, for sacks of grain, for oil to cook with, for fish to nourish their children, for the threadbare minimum of survival. Officials responded with surprise, not anger, not violence, at least not at first. For this kind of disruption had no precedent. These were not slaves. They were trained, essential workers. Their absence delayed not the harvest, but the construction of a pharaoh's final resting place. And eternity in Egypt could not afford delay. So food was sent, late, insufficient, symbolic, enough to calm the surface, not to still the hunger. But the artisans returned. The strike stretched on, not in violence but in insistence. One of the leaders was a scribe named Amenacht. His records, preserved in fragile ostraka and fading ink, offer a rare window into the human heartbeat behind the stone walls of history. He wrote not in verse, not in prophecy, but in the plain lines of men asking not to be forgotten before they were dead. There were threats, there was fear, but there was also resolve. And eventually the rations came, not as favor, but as duty. Work resumed. Tools were lifted once more. The tombs continued to be shaped in silence. But something had shifted. A truth had been etched, not into limestone, but into time, that even in a world bound by cosmic order and divine rule, there were limits, that even under the weight of gods and kings, a man might say, no more. The strike of Deir el-Medina was not a revolution. It did not dismantle the system. The artisans remained workers. Their hunger remained cyclical. Their voices soon fell back into silence. But the echoes endure. What makes this moment matter is its gentleness, its insistence without blood, its humanity. It is not the myth of slaves rising in fury. It is the truth of workers, weary, choosing stillness, choosing to pause their labor, even as the gods waited, even as the tombs gaped open. Their footprints still mark the paths between cliffs and stone. Their homes remain, half buried, half remembered, and their story, small, dignified, necessary, reminds us that history is not only built in battles or temples, it is also built in hunger, in fatigue, in the collective silence of those who asked just once to be fed. And in that silence, heard across the centuries, we find not rebellion, but recognition, a flicker of empathy, a moment of rest. There are wounds that leave no scars, hurts that dwell not in the flesh, but in the unseen corridors of the mind. In ancient Egypt, among the dust and stone and sunlight, there was another weight that pressed upon the laboring class, a weight of vigilance, of uncertainty, of fear that arrived each morning and never quite left. It was not the fear of war or invasion. It was something quieter, more intimate, the fear of failing to serve, the fear of being watched, the fear of punishment without warning, and survival without reward. For the workers, peasants, and servants who formed the spine of Egyptian society, the external hardships, the heat, the hunger, the back-breaking labor, were only part of the story. Beneath those visible trials ran a deeper current of psychological strain, A world structured not just by task, but by tension. Daily life for the poor was tightly governed. The rules were not abstract, they were lived minute by minute. To show hesitation in one's work, to speak out of turn, to arrive late, to slow the pace of one's labor, any of these could bring reprimand. And reprimands were not words, they were lashes, fines, exile. A child might watch his father punished and carry the memory into his own adulthood. A woman might lose a child to exhaustion and return to grinding grain the next day. What makes this fear so enduring is its silence. It had no outlet, no diagnosis, no name. There was no language for trauma, no ritual for healing the mind. The inner life of the worker was his or her own private burden, unshared, often unacknowledged. People coped as best they could. Some turned inward, becoming quiet, obedient, withdrawn. Others hardened, pushing emotion deep into their bodies until it surfaced as illness, aggression, or numbness. Laughter became rare, conversation functional. Every choice, every movement was shaped by the presence of invisible eyes, those of supervisors, priests, ancestors, gods. Even sleep, the only true rest, was not safe. Nightmares haunted the weak. Some dreamt of collapsing walls, of being buried alive in the tombs they helped build. Others dreamt of hunger that could not be satisfied, or of children they could no longer protect. And in the darkest corners of the village, there were those who whispered of spirits, the Akh of the dead, returning to torment the living who had failed to honor them. Superstition and trauma danced together in the shadows, feeding off one another. Children absorbed this fear from the air. They learned to keep their heads down, their mouths closed. They learned that questions were dangerous and that dreams were better left unspoken. A 5-year-old might carry water to a work site, not just to help, but to show obedience. A 10-year-old might understand already what happened to those who disobeyed. Childhood was not protected. It was conditioned. And then there was grief. In a world where infant mortality was high, where illness struck without remedy, and where the state measured people in quotas, grief became another silent companion. Women buried children, men buried wives. There were no psychologists, no rituals for sorrow, unless one was noble. The poor buried their pain in the same soil they worked every day. The mind, in such an environment, adapted by narrowing, by focusing only on the next task, the next mouthful, the next sunrise. Long-term hope was a luxury. People lived not for tomorrow, but for the avoidance of punishment today. There were moments of warmth, a shared drink, a song hummed under the breath, a glance between friends. But even these were shadowed by the knowledge that comfort could be interrupted at any time. That survival depended not only on effort, but on silence, on invisibility, on the suppression of the self. In modern terms, we might call it chronic stress. We might see symptoms of anxiety, depression, dissociation. But in ancient Egypt, these were not conditions to be named or treated. They were the fabric of existence for the many who toiled under sun and law. And so the psychological burden endured, passed from parent to child, woven into gesture, into ritual, into silence. 1,000 years of it, more. To live in ancient Egypt as a laborer was to carry fear like a second skin. Not dramatic fear, but daily fear. Not terror, but the ache of knowing that one's worth was always conditional, that one's body, one's voice, one's very presence had value only as long as it served, and even then, only sometimes. There is a story that temples tell, carved in stone and gold, where harmony reigns and the divine walks beside mankind. In this story, the pharaoh is radiant, the gods are generous, and Egypt is a land of balance. But beneath that story, beneath the polished limestone, beneath the inked papyri, another tale unfolds, one written not in hieroglyphs, but in hunger, in the cracked hands of farmers, in the sun-blistered backs of men who never saw the chambers they helped create. This is the story of inequality made sacred, of how the elite and the peasant lived not merely in different houses, but in different worlds. In the cities and temple precincts, the elite lived with ease. Their homes were spacious, adorned with woven linens, pottery, even painted murals. The air inside was cooler, shaded by papyrus blinds and softened by breezes funneled through carved windows. Servants brought bowls of figs, fish, bread, and wine. They bathed regularly, rubbed oils into their skin, and wore perfumes crafted from imported resins and flowers. Their lives were cushioned, their work intellectual or ritualistic. A scribe might write for hours, but his hands did not bleed. A priest might walk in incense, but never in mud. Just beyond these walls, life bore a different rhythm. For the peasant, the field laborer, the village woman, the day began with dirt and ended in exhaustion. Homes were small, made of mud brick, with thatched roofs and earthen floors. Furniture was sparse. Light came from oil lamps or the open door. The air inside was thick with smoke from cooking fires, with the scent of sweat and sometimes of decay. Diet was meager: onions, lentils, barley bread, the occasional handful of dates. Meat was rare, reserved for festival days or as offerings never meant to be eaten by the one who prepared them. Water had to be fetched and filtered through fabric. Most drank it warm. Illness was a fact of life, and healing a privilege for others. The elite had access to physicians, temples, and amulets of protection. The poor had prayers, herbs, and endurance. When a noble child fell ill, treatments were sought, gods were consulted, rituals were performed. When a peasant child fell ill, the mother waited and hoped. If the child died, the family returned to work. Grief did not interrupt the harvest. Time, too, was divided unequally. The elite had time to reflect, to worship, to dream. Their tombs show scenes of leisure, hunting in marshes, playing games, watching dancers. These were not fantasies. They reflected a reality of spare time. For the poor, time was labor. There were no games painted on their walls because there were no walls, no time, only survival. Even shade was a privilege. In the intense heat of midday, priests and scribes retreated to cool courtyards. But farmers and builders remained outside, their tasks dictated by season, sun, and overseer. The skin of the elite was pale, their hands soft. The skin of the poor cracked, their shoulders hunched from strain. Religion reinforced the gap. The gods, though accessible in theory, were mediated through priests who were of the elite. The great temples received offerings from across the land, but those offerings rarely returned to the villagers who grew them. Divinity was dressed in gold, while the hands that carried that gold went unclothed. Even in death the difference endured. The elite prepared for the afterlife with care. Mummification, tomb goods, magical texts. Their names were chiseled into stone, protected by curses meant to ensure memory. The poor were buried in sand, quickly, with little ceremony. Their names, if known at all, were spoken for a few days, then lost. And yet both elite and poor worshipped the same gods. They both feared chaos, honored the dead, and told stories of judgment in the next world. But for the elite, religion offered continuity. For the poor, it offered hope, not of luxury, but of fairness, of a life beyond this one where balance might finally be real. This was Egypt, a land of wonder and a land of walls. Some built temples, others fed the builders. Some were remembered. Others remained in the background, their lives reduced to brushstrokes or erased entirely. And so, as we gaze upon the serene images of noblemen with lotus flowers or queens with divine headdresses, we might pause. Just outside the frame stood those who carried their thrones, who ground the pigments for their portraits, who baked the bread placed before their altars. The elite bathed in light, the peasants walked in shadow, and the shadow too is part of the story. There are cultures where pain is hidden, concealed behind courtesy, stoicism, or shame. And there are others, often shaped by necessity, where pain becomes a way of life, a kind of language passed through generations not by choice, but by endurance. In ancient Egypt, among the poor, the laborers, the field hands, and stone haulers, pain was not just frequent, it was expected. It was not abnormal. It was the measure of worth. From the moment a child could carry water or gather sticks, they began learning this language, not through words, but through watching. Watching their parents ignore aching limbs, watching neighbors treat wounds with ash and keep walking, watching older siblings fall and rise without tears. They learned early and deeply that to complain was not survival. Silence was. Pain became a form of education. It taught obedience. A misstep in the field or delay in the workshop could result in physical punishment, lashes from a whip, a blow with a stick, a shout from an overseer. Children absorbed these consequences with wide eyes. And over time, they adjusted, not because it hurt less, but because the hurt had no audience. It simply had to be endured. In adulthood, the pain intensified. Men who worked in quarries returned with swollen joints, cracked heels, backs curved unnaturally from years of lifting. Women who ground grain on stone slabs developed deep grooves in their knees and wrists. Midwives bore the weight of every difficult birth. The marks of labor were not seen as misfortunes, they were expected outcomes. A body that did not hurt was not working hard enough, and there was a kind of pride in that. Not the pride of accomplishment, but the pride of perseverance. To suffer quietly was to show strength. To complain was to expose weakness, not only to others, but to oneself. In this way, pain became a tool of social bonding. A man limping home from the fields did not expect pity. He expected acknowledgement, a glance, a nod. A silence that said, "I see your burden." Among women, shared aches became shared space. Kneeling side by side at grinding stones, they pressed their sorrows into the dough and baked them into bread. They didn't need to speak. Pain was the dialogue. Even rituals reflected this normalization. The annual labor of harvesting under an unforgiving sun. The climbing of scaffolds without rest. The funerals where few tears were shed, not from indifference, but from exhaustion. Life was structured not to heal pain, but to incorporate it. The rhythm of work, the silence of meals, the simplicity of ceremonies, these were shaped by a people who expected suffering. Religion, too, reinforced the place of pain. Texts spoke of purification through hardship, of the soul being tested in fire, of the body being a vessel through which the gods measured one's devotion. The afterlife promised peace, yes, but it also promised recognition. Recognition of toil. A reward not for being good, but for surviving. Thus, pain acquired a moral dimension. To endure it without anger was a sign of inner order, of ma'at, the balance that governed the universe. Those who bore their suffering well were seen not as cursed, but as spiritually disciplined, and those who did not, those who cried, rebelled, or broke, were viewed with suspicion, as though their pain was a failure, not of the body, but of character. In this way, empathy became difficult. Because to survive, people learned not only to endure their own suffering, but to overlook the suffering of others. A neighbor's swollen ankle, a child's persistent cough, a wife's silent weeping after losing a child. These were seen, felt, mourned, but rarely spoken of. Acknowledging pain too openly risked opening one's own. And so, the community became a chorus of quiet. Generations passed like this, from father to son, from mother to daughter, the lessons of silence, the rituals of endurance. The belief that pain was not something to escape, but something to carry with dignity. And over time, this became the norm, the fabric of life, and perhaps in some ways that still echoes, in the unspoken aches we accept, in the inherited beliefs about strength, in the pride we take in surviving things we never should have had to endure. The workers of ancient Egypt lived in a world where pain was constant, but more than that, it was shared. And in that sharing, in that grim solidarity, there was a kind of humanity, a quiet, aching bond that linked them across time, across hardship, across the desert silence. In the dry air of ancient Egypt, where heat shimmered above the land like a mirage, oppression took forms both visible and invisible. There were chains, yes, of debt, of class, of labor. But there were also chains forged by nature itself, not metallic, but meteorological, not fashioned by kings, but by climate. And though few ever named it, it ruled all the same. This is the concept some modern scholars have called climatic slavery, a condition where the harshness of the natural world is not simply endured, but used, where the searing sun, the failing Nile, the unrelenting wind become agents of control, where environment is not neutral, but weaponized by structure, by hierarchy, by need. Ancient Egypt was a land of awe and fragility. Its prosperity depended almost entirely on the Nile. Its seasons, its crops, its trade routes. Without the Nile, Egypt was only desert. And even with it, survival was conditional. A single year of low flooding could mean starvation. A delay in rains upstream could empty storehouses. Drought was not a risk. It was a rhythm, a breath the land sometimes forgot to take. But that unpredictability did not burden everyone equally. The elite had reserves. They had granaries tucked away behind temple walls. They had networks of traders, of priests, of scribes to forecast, calculate, and redirect scarcity. The poor had none of these. For them, when the waters failed, labor intensified. When the heat rose, shelter grew scarce. When grain ran low, hunger became a form of discipline. In this way, climate was not just a challenge, it became a collaborator of authority. Work schedules bent around the sun, not in deference, but in exploitation. Labor began before light and continued through the harshest hours, not because it was efficient, but because the sun itself became a form of control. To be seen resting at noon was to risk suspicion. To seek shade was to invite punishment. The burning heat, rather than slowing the machine, was built into its gears, and heat did more than punish the body. It shaped the soul. It dictated how people moved, how they dressed, when they spoke. It frayed tempers. It blurred thoughts. It isolated. A man too tired to speak was also too tired to resist. A woman who lost consciousness from heat stroke could not protest. The air itself became part of the architecture of power. Sand was another tool. In the quarries, in the desert roads, in the mines, it filled the lungs, stripped the skin, wore down tools and time alike. Sandstorms were not just weather, they were events of silence, of blindness, of helplessness. And again, it was the poor who faced them. The overseers stayed inside. Even the night offered no escape. The heat lingered in the brick walls. The dryness cracked lips and split skin. Sleep, when it came, was restless. And with each dawn, the same cruel partnership resumed, man and environment, bound together by labor. But perhaps the most painful part of this arrangement was the way it was justified. People were taught that the sun was divine, that Ra traveled the sky to bless the land, that the order of nature mirrored the order of society, that to sweat was to serve, and to suffer was to align oneself with cosmic balance. Resistance, then, became not just dangerous, but sacrilegious. In this way, the climate was spiritualized, pain was naturalized, inequality was made sacred. And so, generation after generation, men and women lived in a furnace not just of weather, but of expectation. They did not ask whether the sun could be resisted. They asked only how long they could last beneath it. Climatic slavery did not require whips at every moment. The environment itself delivered discipline, delivered limits, delivered submission. And as we imagine these people, not just in their toil, but in their daily struggle to breathe, to think, to endure, we begin to understand that power can wear many faces. It can wear a crown, or a whip, or a burning sky. The land that birthed monuments also birthed heat that broke bodies. And while we remember the stones, we must not forget the skin that burned beneath them. The climate was not merely backdrop. It was a participant in the oppression. It was not only the pharaoh who ruled. There's something paradoxical in the way we gaze upon ancient Egypt. The golden masks, the hieroglyphs, the pyramids, so vast and precise that they seem almost eternal. We marvel at their symmetry, at the way time has failed to erase them. And yet, beneath that fascination, there is something else. A quieter current, a draw not only to the grandeur, but to the cost, to the suffering behind the splendor, to the silence behind the stone. Why does the pain of ancient laborers hold our attention? Perhaps because it speaks to something deep and familiar. A feeling, even now, that behind every towering success, someone is kneeling. That behind every act of creation, there is someone who was broken. We don't need to be told that the pyramids were not built by magic. We know. And yet, we stare, not just in awe, but in mourning. Mourning for the forgotten, for those whose names were never carved, for those whose stories remain in bone and dust and silence. The fascination with ancient Egypt is not just about power, it is about endurance, about the way people lived and died beneath systems too vast to question, about how pain, when repeated over generations, becomes almost sacred, almost invisible. And perhaps when we lie awake at night feeling small beneath our own burdens, that ancient pain gives us strange comfort, not because it is beautiful, but because it reminds us that we are not the first to carry more than we should. That the weight we feel on our chests, the exhaustion in our limbs, the doubt in our minds, these have been felt before. That even in distant times, people struggled with the same rhythms: wake, labor, ache, sleep, and repeat. And there is peace in knowing that. A quiet kind of solidarity, not joyful, not triumphant, but steady. We are drawn to the suffering of ancient Egypt because it mirrors our own. Dressed differently, yes, spoken in different tongues, but at its core, the same hunger, the same heat, the same hierarchy. We recognize ourselves in their aching joints, in their bent backs, in their silent prayers, and there is something in that recognition that allows us to grieve. Not only for them, but for ourselves. Because we too live in a world that often values monument over man, that rewards appearances over well-being, that demands labor without always offering rest. In the stillness of night, when the world is quiet and our minds begin to wander, we might find ourselves returning to those deserts, to those long-forgotten workers. We imagine the feel of the stone beneath their feet, the sting of sand in their eyes, the taste of warm water from a clay jar, the sound of an overseer's footsteps approaching from behind. And we are reminded that history is not just made of kings and dates. It is made of bodies, of burdens, of breath. What draws us to ancient Egypt in the end is not the illusion of eternity, but the evidence of exhaustion. The quiet truth that even in a civilization obsessed with the afterlife, the present was often unbearable. And perhaps that is why we listen, why we return. Why we stare at these ruins not only with wonder, but with reverence, not for the greatness that was built, but for the pain that endured to build it. In the vast whispering sands that stretch across the Egyptian landscape, there are tombs, grand tombs, hidden tombs, forgotten tombs. But beyond them, beneath them, there are stories even more silent, not carved in stone, not gilded or wrapped in linen, but embedded in the very soil, the legacy of those who lived beneath the greatness, who carved monuments but were not deemed worthy of one themselves, who endured without record, who died without inscription. These were the builders of eternity, and yet their own time was left unmarked. There is something haunting in that, not in the horror of violence or cruelty, though both were present, but in the sheer quiet of it, the invisibility, the fact that so many bodies returned to the earth with nothing to speak their names, but the echo of what they made for others. The pyramids still stand. The names of kings are still spoken. But the men who placed each stone, who carried the tools, who stitched the baskets, who passed water from hand to hand in the burning sun, they are mostly unnamed. Their stories, if they remain, live in broken bones, in worn tools, in the patterns of injury that speak of lives lived too hard, too fast, too young. What was their legacy? It wasn't written. It wasn't preserved in scrolls or sung in ceremonies. Their legacy was labor. It was the persistence of motion, the enduring of suffering, the quiet acceptance of roles never chosen. And yet, even without voices, they speak. Through the alignment of quarries, through the unfinished walls of a tomb abandoned mid-chisel, through the fossilized impressions of sandals in the dust of a worker's path, through a buried jar of grain never consumed, through the cramped sleeping quarters near a royal project site. Their voices never screamed, but they remained. They remind us that civilization does not rise on ideas alone. It rises on the aching bodies of those who carry it forward without credit. It is one thing to admire a monument. It is another to kneel beside it and imagine the hands that once bled to create it. The legacy of ancient Egypt, for all its beauty, was bought in lives. And for those who were silenced, that legacy is still there, still asking to be seen, not just as footnotes or laborers or data, but as people. As individuals who woke, worked, and wore out under the same sun that lights our world now. To reflect on them is not merely to look back. It is to ask something of ourselves, about who we remember, about who we honor, about whose pain we are willing to let remain invisible. Because the silence of the workers is not absence, it is endurance. And perhaps in this final moment, as night wraps around you and the last sounds of the day fade into quiet, you can feel it too. That soft, vast presence. That echo beneath the sand, that immense human truth, that some of the greatest things ever built were paid for with lives that never even had the chance to scream. And so we remember them, not with fire, but with stillness, not with glory, but with reverence, not with names, but with a long, deep breath taken in the dark, where their stories now sleep. Have a peaceful night. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, I would be deeply grateful if you offered a silent click on the like button and perhaps subscribed for more winding explorations through the haunting and intricate corridors of history. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.